In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about the India-US relationship, not just in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but also in the wake of the visit of Daleep Singh, the US Deputy National Security Advisor, who was in Delhi last week, and you know that he made these very insensitive remarks about how India will have to pay the consequences. He used that word, consequences, in the context of its own growing relationship with Russia. And we know now that the 2+2 dialogue between India and the US, which means that the foreign and the defense ministers' dialogues will take place in Washington, D.C. on the 11th of April. And this will give both sides a chance to talk to each other very frankly about what's going on. But before I explain any further, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do click on the join button, pay rupees 159 only, and become a subscriber to The Print. You know that you have been helping us, and we are very grateful for your support these last several months of the pandemic and afterwards. But we would like you to continue to give us that support. So do pay rupees 159. It's very little money, but do become a subscriber of The Print. You will not just get special benefits, but also advance notice and advance information about what The Print has on its platform. So do click on the join button. It's only rupees 159. Back to my column, Global Print, on the Print's website, which I hope you've read by now, in which I talk about the growing India-US relationship. There have been a couple of twists and turns these last few days, especially when Daleep Singh, the US Deputy National Security Advisor, made his very unfortunate comments about India having to pay consequences if it grows its relationship with Russia. Now, that is certainly not that any Indian wants to hear a foreign power telling you that you must behave in one way or the other, or you must grow or decrease or enhance your ties with X or Y country. India is a very proud and independent country. We've had a long history of being so, and especially we are the inheritors of our freedom movement, in which we kicked out the imperialists in a non-violent way. So for somebody like Daleep Singh to come and tell you exactly what he thinks of you and what you should do, that didn't go down very well here. But like I said before, on the 11th of April, the 2+2 dialogue between India and the US, which means that the foreign and the defense ministers, so that's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, as well as the Defense Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, will be traveling to the US, and they will be talking to their counterparts in the US. This is a physical meeting, and it will give a chance for a free, frank exchange of views between the two countries, not just on the Ukraine crisis. But let me say here that the Ukraine crisis will naturally be on top of the agenda of both countries. Now, let me say here that there have been some, to put it mildly, some twists and turns in the India-US relationship recently. Now, I would argue that if there was perhaps a US ambassador in Delhi, the US embassy has been headless for the last 8 months. Actually, the US embassy has been headless for about a year since its previous incumbent left after the change of guard when Joe Biden becomes the president of America. And since then, there has been no US ambassador. And Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, has been in this very complicated congressional process of confirmation. But it now seems that the US Senate is not very comfortable with confirming Eric Garcetti as the new ambassador for India because of something completely unrelated. There were charges of sexual harassment against a member of Mr. Garcetti's team, against one of his staffers at the time when he was an active mayor. Mr. Garcetti says that he knows nothing about it, but these sexual harassment allegations have acquired a life of their own, and in the US Senate it seems that there aren't enough votes for Mr. Joe Biden to be able to pull off this appointment to India. Now, that is perhaps a big blow for the Biden administration, but be that as it may, that has nothing to do with India in one sense, because I think India would welcome any ambassador that the Americans send. But the short point that I'm trying to make is that the absence of a U.S. ambassador is allowing these irritants to acquire a much greater life of their own. If there was somebody in India, for example, he or she would be able to explain what the Daleep Singh remarks meant, why President Joe Biden some weeks ago called India a shaky ally in its own war against Russia, which has mounted an invasion of Ukraine. Now it's been more than 40 days. So these have been stumbling blocks these last few days, people saying one thing or another. And the absence of a US ambassador has, I think, exaggerated that that sense of dismay and perhaps even catastrophe, which I think the 2+2 dialogue will address. Let me say here that India believes that the US relationship is not just important, but perhaps a foremost relationship. It's a strategic partnership embedded in decades of a bilateral confidence, which is part of an understanding right from political strategic issues to diaspora issues. So for these couple of irritants these last few weeks, hopefully both will overcome them. I think the Indian side recognizes that the Americans are doing what they can to be able to be more understanding of India's position on Russia. The US understands, and I've spoken to several people these last few days, also done several interviews, and you might want to look at a debate that I did recently on Russia, in which I had Tanvi Madan, Shashank Joshi, and Mr. Zorawar Daleep Singh explaining all the various viewpoints of what America is thinking about and what India indeed is thinking about these differences or these alleged differences of opinion. Now, for India, it's an important relationship, but India also recognizes that the US also believes that this is a foremost relationship for the US. If you look at the United States' recently released Indo-Pacific strategy, it was released last month, just a couple of weeks after the Russians went into Ukraine, in which it says very clearly that China is the principal challenger for the US. Now, obviously, in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has become a principal challenger for the Americans. But we have seen very clearly how the Americans, for the time being, are focusing their energies on subjugating the big, bad Russian bear, according to them, Vladimir Putin. They have called him all kinds of names. I don't need to tell you how they've described him. But the Americans still remain a very, very powerful nation, able to deal with both theaters of action at the same time. On the one hand, subjugating the Russians, which they believe are a principal challenger. Clearly, the fight in Ukraine is not just a fight between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is a very, very small antagonist in this particular conflict. It's the Americans who are fighting the Russians via Ukraine. That's been very evident these last 40 days. But for the time being, at least, the Russians right up front, a key principal challenger of the Americans. But in the newly released or the recently released Indo-Pacific strategy, it's also been made very clear that China remains a principal challenger. And that should be music to India's ears, because these last couple of years with Chinese troops standing on the line of actual control, facing off against Indian troops, there have been several violent incursions, including the death of 20 Indian soldiers in the Galwan Valley 2 years ago. China remains, for India at least, a principal adversary. So if the US also believes that China is a principal challenger for itself, then US and India can have a lot of understanding on this front. Also, India understands very clearly that the recent trade pact signed between India and Australia, it was a virtual meeting between Prime Minister Modi and the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, the Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, ECTA as it is called. Now, the Indian side understands clearly that this could not have happened without a nod from Australia's treaty ally, the US. And let me give you one or two examples why. If you look at the fine print closely, 96.4% of India's exports to Australia will be exempt from any duty, which means that that zero duty will be applied on this value. So 96.4%, that's a hell of a lot. Clearly, the Australians have given in to a lot of Indian demands, because this ECTA, talks on this ECTA have been going on for a few years. There will be, of course, the Australians also get a big share of India's market, including on wine and vegetables, dairy. Dairy has been something that India has argued about, so that has been also resolved in India's favor, may I add. Clearly, the Australians believing in the US argument that India needs to be assuaged, reassured that China is a principal challenger, which it is both for Australia and for India. But this would not have happened, this ECTA would not have seen the light of day if the Americans had not pushed the Australians to do this. So we see the power of America. It's a huge country. It may be bleeding from the war in Afghanistan and from the fact that it's been outstretched, overstretched in its various endeavors across the globe. But the fact remains that the Americans are a huge power and that you cannot underestimate them. The Japanese Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, when he was in Delhi, there has been a lot of talk that the Japanese will diversify several of their investments in China and bring them to India. That hasn't happened really so far because a lot of those investments have gone to Southeast Asian nations like Vietnam. But I think if the US puts its weight behind these efforts, which is that the ASEAN nations, the Southeast Asian nations, as well as Australia, Japan, South Korea, if they can enhance, increase not just trade, but also investment in India, especially in the wake of the pandemic, which has hurt India very badly, then that would be a huge red feather and cementing of the India-US relationship as well. Perhaps these are some of the things that that will be talked about in the 2+2 dialogue. But let's talk a little bit about India's friendship with Russia. Now, the Americans also know that this is a very special relationship, and I'm not just talking about what happened in 1971 when the former Soviet Union came to the aid of India in its war against Pakistan. That is a 50-year-old history that nobody will forget here in Delhi, certainly. But in these last few years, in these last few decades as well, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, even as the Russian economy shrank, and we know that the trade between India and Russia is very, very small. It's less than $10 billion. A lot of it is the purchases of Russian defense equipment. There's very little other commodities trade between India and Russia. And in comparison, the trade between India and the US is at least 10 times more than $100 billion, and is expected to ramp up to at least $150 billion if services are included in that figure. So these last few decades, as the Russian economy shrank, and this has been one of the greatest failures of the India-Russia relationship, that the economic part of the relationship hasn't really taken off. It's been restricted to defense imports on the part of India. But the Russians have also given the kind of technology that nobody else in the world does, both equipment and technology. So whether it was leasing a nuclear submarine to India, that has happened twice over, helping India with its own nuclear submarine project, equipping Indian troops facing off against Chinese troops on the line of actual control in Ladakh. This is the stuff of the Russia-India relationship that few people talk about. And of course, the Americans know they have the kind of power that we have talked about that's unimaginable. They also have the kind of intelligence to understand what's going on. But despite that, the Americans are putting a lot of weight behind the fact that India should not create another mechanism to conduct trade between itself and Russia, meaning the rupee-ruble mechanism that has been on the anvil for India to purchase or to continue to purchase Russian defense equipment as well as spot purchases of oil. At last count, this deeply discounted oil that Russia has been offering amounts to about 21 million tons. Now, all of last year in 2021, through the pandemic year, India imported about 26 million tons of oil, and in these last few weeks, it's already imported 21 million tons. Nirmala Sitharaman, the finance minister, has said in Parliament that India will take advantage of the fact that Russia is offering such cheap oil because we understand and we know that India imports 80% of its energy needs. Now that's huge, because when people inside the country, when prices of fuel go up and there are protests and unhappiness on the streets, then the Prime Minister knows that this can only be alleviated if you bring the price of fuel down. And how do you do that? If you are able to stabilize the supply of oil to your own country and to alleviate the needs of the people. So this is a very, very complex and a very sensitive issue. The price of oil impacts Indian domestic politics very, very intimately. We know that by now. But what the Americans are concerned about, and that's what Daleep Singh's remarks actually are, is that, yes, the Americans are saying, fine, you buy your spot oil, you continue to carry out other defense equipment purchases from the Russians, but do not create an alternative financial mechanism that will then be an alternative to the dollar. Now we know that the dollar is a currency that underpins all financial transactions across the world. That is how the Americans are able to leverage their power. So I think the Americans are a bit upset about the fact that India and Russia are actually considering an alternative mechanism, even if it's a small one that's limited to the very small marginal trade, in only $10 billion, marginal to the rest of India's global exports. But having said that, the Americans understand that if India and Russia are going to create a rupee-ruble mechanism that is not going to disappear overnight, even once the Ukraine war comes to an end, then that is something that the Americans will have no control over. And if the Chinese are going to take a leaf out of that book, if they create an alternative mechanism that's dependent on the yuan rather than the dollar, then I think this will affect America's financial power globally going forward. So a lot of this is going to be talked about in the 2+2 dialogue for sure. The bottom line remaining that for India, the US relationship is a very strong one, a very important one. It is definitely a strategic partnership that India wants to keep. It doesn't want to upset the US too much, and that's why it will have to find a way to finesse, to balance its own growing relationship and its own need of the Russia relationship, while in the same time reassuring the Americans that what it's doing. But we shall be following this story in the coming days and weeks, and I shall be there to tell you what's going on. So do continue to read my column, Global Print, on the Print's website, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this video. Thank you so much for watching.